everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of Viral Banter, the Generation Liberty Forum. Today's episode is a Women in Liberty special with an amazing all-female panel here to discuss the major issues facing women and to figure out why freedom is such an important issue for women. First up, we have Theodora Pantelich. She is the campus coordinator at the University of Melbourne, alongside John Hajek, but more importantly, she is my assistant at the IPA office, the Generation Liberty assistant. So she is the person who stops my life from falling apart. It's her first time on the show, so please welcome Theodora.
Hi Renee, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Theodora, how are you holding up at home?
I'm going pretty well. I've got a lot to keep me busy with uni and work, so I'm not going insane just yet, but it's been good to spend some quality time with family, which I wouldn't normally get to do, so it's not too bad.
That's good to hear. And welcome back a familiar face to the show, the political commentator extraordinaire, Anjali from Macquarie University. How are you?
I'm good, Renee. Thanks for having me back on.
No dramas. We love having you on the show. And next up, we have one of our newest researchers in the IPA team, Dara McDonald, who's in our legal research part of the IPA. Welcome to the show, Dara.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And how are you holding up at home, Dara, in this weird lockdown times?
Pretty well, actually. I think I'm enjoying the time to, just settle and focus on what's important and think about the big issues and everything. So that's been a benefit to being locked down, I suppose.
That's good to hear. And finally, another new face, but many of you may have heard of this young lady as she has been in the Daily Telegraph more times than we can count. Joanne Tran, thank you for joining us, Joanne.
Thank you for having me on, Renee.
So how are you coping in New South Wales? Though you just got the message a few days ago that you're being let free. New South Wales is being slightly open soon, isn't it?
I'm going relatively okay, apart from being in lockdown. But we've recently we've got news that we can start visiting our friends' houses on Friday, so that should be something to look forward to.
Sounds good. And so this is the Women in Liberty special. So I thought I would start with one of the biggest questions kind of in relation to this, which is, why do you guys think individual freedom is so important for women in particular? Theodora, we'll start with you. Why do you think that women should value individual freedom and protect individual freedom?
Well, I think history has shown us the terrible impacts that an unfree society will have for women, especially in the last century. Socialist and communist regimes, which initially claimed that they would promote women's rights, they quickly did the opposite. So, for example, my family escaped from communist Yugoslavia. That was a complete nightmare. I mean, obviously for society as a whole, but for women especially. Even in the 21st century, we have so many examples of women being oppressed in unfree nations. Like in Cuba, for example, people will praise the Cuban socialized healthcare system, and their health officials claim that they will have, 4.4 deaths per 1,000 live births, claiming that it shows that how safe socialized healthcare is for women. But they conveniently make no mention of the fact that Cuba has one of the highest forced abortion rates in the world, with 72 abortions per 100 births, because doctors will continually force women who are seen as having high-risk pregnancies to abort. So when you look at the reality of socialist regimes and the impacts that they have on women, it just doesn't look that appealing. So despite the left's best efforts to portray socialism as an ideal state for advancing women's rights, the opposite is true. And I think women should prize individual freedom even more because of the lessons of failed socialist regimes.
And yeah, there's some really interesting stats and points that you bring up there that we learn from history. But Dara, what are your thoughts on this? Why do you think women in particular should value individual freedom?
Well, I think freedom is a value that everyone should have, basically. And, the first wave of feminism was basically called liberal feminism because the claim was that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be something that is accessible to everyone, and with that rights claim should be expanded to include women as opposed to not include women. So women should have the right to own property and have autonomy over their lives, basically. So I think it's important for everyone, and women are no exception to that.
Yeah, I really like that. It's important to everyone, and we're part of the equation, and that was bringing women into the vote and into everything, was bringing them into part of, especially specifically within the West, within the responsibility and not only, the rights, but also the responsibilities of being a free Western person. So I think that's a really interesting point. Anjali, what are your thoughts on this?
I definitely agree with both Theodora and Dara there. I believe that a society that is built on individual freedom provides the mindset for women to really live their lives that they're choosing and to exercise their potential as an individual more efficiently. I think that where individuals are given choice, they can pursue their interests and goals, and we tend to see better outcomes and increased prosperity across the board when women do so. So certainly I think that where women have that individual freedom, particularly in classical liberal societies, they are able to choose their careers, educations, and lives that really correspond to their values and aren't fettered by what the state wants.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's a really beautiful point. But it seems to me, though we're all talking about why freedom is so great for us and why we kind of lean classically liberal, that the default position is kind of assumed to be left-leaning or progressive. And when you tell someone, maybe when you're at a university or even just in main society, that you're a liberal voter or that you're conservative or that you're libertarian, there seems to be a bit of a they think you're kind of unusual for being that. Why do you think that is, Theodora?
Well, I recently heard Ben Shapiro say that women get more conservative when they become mothers. So I think there might be some truth in this idea that when you're at uni, you're so constantly bombarded with left-wing ideology in tutors and lectures that a lot of young women become left-leaning or progressive, and then as they grow older, they start to lean more right. But I also think that maybe young women sort of mistakenly associate the left with compassion, that they think the political left somehow has a monopoly on compassion and kindness, while the right is more rational. So I think that plays a part as well. But I don't, obviously that's not the case. I mean, everyone on this panel is compassionate and concerned with improving society. So I think there's just a misconception that the left is caring and the right isn't.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It kind of comes down to that. I actually don't think, even though everyone's associated with Dennis Prager, the left, the left think we're evil. We just think they're wrong. I actually think it's someone else. Maybe we'll put a little thing down here of the actual attribute quote, but everyone thinks it's Prager because he said it so much. But Joanne, have you generally found that to be the case, that people kind of assume because you're a young woman living in Australia that you should be left or progressive?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And going off what Theodora said, I think she completely got that point right in terms of the fact that we often, especially younger people, tend to associate freedom, compassion as exclusively to the left and not to the right at all. And I think that very much comes off with the fact that we are constantly bombarded at university or in schools that, for example, the right or politics, if you're conservative or libertarian, then you don't believe in freedom or compassion or being kind to people.
Yeah, I think one of the most obvious examples I have of that is, I remember a teacher in primary school, and back when I was in primary school, a while ago now, so this has been going on for a while, it explained politics to a group of grade 2 children. And she said, well, Labor believes like Robin Hood and giving the poor money and taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and liberals just believe to give all the money to the rich and it will eventually get to the poor, which was how when you describe that to a child that early on and you put that in their brain, that liberals are just this kind of evil, want to keep everything, I think that does eventually spread out into the culture. But Dara, there was a time in Australian history where women were considered more likely than men to vote Conservative or, you know, Liberal within the Australian context. You know, when Menzies founded the Liberal Party, there were more female members than male. When George Reid, our third Prime Minister, went out to do talks, one of his most successful parts of his campaign was going to speak to women's groups, and some of the most successful Conservative leaders from then spoke to women's group. Why do you think it has changed so much since then?
I think even the suffragettes, for instance, were incredibly laissez-faire about liberty, and particularly economic liberty, because that was what enabled them to have autonomy over their own lives. It is a natural good for women to be able to make their own decisions and have autonomy, both, you know, to make their own choices and live their own lives as they see fit. So liberalism has a definite appeal to women in the past. I think the fact that it has changed is actually a measure of success, in the sense that by and large we in Western countries as females have all these rights that we have acquired over the history, and now, in order to maintain relevance, the women's movement has to become more radicalized, and by doing that they've put themselves in the category of being this radical leftist tradition as opposed to being a liberal tradition.
Yeah, and it's also disappointing, because if you listen to a lot of people who talk about the successful elements of women's liberation, such as Christina Hoff Sommers, you can't be this exclusive radical wing to get any progress done. It's when the kind of two aspects of femininity work together that's you get progress. So when conservative and progressive women work together in the past, that's when you get liberation of women. And it's the same is true even for the civil rights movement. It was when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King worked together, two extremes coming together, or not one extreme and one not so extreme coming together, and that's where you get progress. But moving on to something a little bit more lighthearted. So this is a common question I ask while I'm going around the country getting to know students. But I'm going to put a little twist on it this time, which is, we all know identity politics has now infiltrated the university. So my classic question is, what is the craziest thing you've heard a lecturer or tutor say, but this time specifically in regards to gender? What crazy kind of thing you've heard from a lecturer in regards to identity politics in the gender realm? So Theodora, we'll start with you.
In a Soviet history class I took last year, we had several weeks which were dedicated to gender in the Soviet Union, but instead of looking at the suffering of women in communist Russia, we were repeatedly told that Stalin brought about an age of equality for women, which is absolute nonsense, because Stalin, hello, suffering, starvation.
Dara, what are your thoughts? Did you have anything particularly crazy, or was there no gender studies in your law subjects?
Well, I've attended uni quite some years ago, or some years ago anyway, and also I didn't take any gender identity type classes. But
probably a smart move.
Probably the thing which was most obvious was the kind of cultural relativism. For instance, in a public international law class, on one hand, they would disparage Western democracies for their record on domestic violence, at the same time as excusing female genital mutilation. So I think that was probably more horrific in my idea, that you would be so dismissive of other oppressions or other females in the world that are being oppressed. Meanwhile, being so critical of Western countries.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common hearing from my time in university. There was definitely a lot of that. And Anjali, have you come across any of this craziness in your university days?
So certainly at university, identity politics is rife on campus. I can't really recall any specific moments when a lecturer or a tutor has said something crazy about gender, but I have seen identity politics infiltrated in academic discourse that I've studied, from law and politics to literature. So certainly I have noted that within my own studies.
And Joanne, you've actually this is your first year at university, which is a crazy year to be your first year at university. So have you come across this yet in your very short time? And if not, what has it been like just starting uni and this being how you started uni?
It's certainly been an interesting start to uni. On campus, I've actually only been at uni for around 3 weeks, and ever since we've been doing remote learning. So personally, I haven't encountered any crazy stories about identity politics. But if I was to draw on from some like personal experience, I remember during high school, I went to like an all-girls school, and I remember every time I would go on like do like a media appearance, and there was that one specific time when I was on a radio show, and the host was a male. And I remember when I was going back to school the next day, I walked into a conversation of a girl saying that the only reason why I got him was because, like they were making up like stupid rumors and stories about how like, the only reason why I got him was because, like if I was like sexually promiscuous or something like that. And I just found it completely disgusting, because I just think it's so hypocritical of them to claim like the right is sexist and everything, yet when it comes to like dealing with someone their age and someone of their own gender as well, they say something like completely disgusting like that.
I think that's a really good point, Joanne, and I think it's something I've experienced, and a lot of women who are not on the left experiences this. We care so much about women. We hate sexism, but when you say something that's not in line with the progressive values, it suddenly changes, and it suddenly they would say things to you or do things to you that are completely inappropriate just because you're not within their ideological tent anymore. And I think even though it's a horrific thing that the left does, I think it generally damages them. I've met a lot of people, not only from the female perspective, but from the identity politics spectrum along with race and religion, where people kind of realize, oh, wait, you were just caring about those issues because it worked for me politically. And when they realize that, it kind of opens their eyes. So I think in a lot of cases, it can do a lot of damage, but also can show people the ideological underpinning of what someone's saying. But kind of related to that, have any of you girls experienced an issue of sexism? And for me, I personally I would say a lot of the issues of sexism I've actually experienced on the left, but I don't want to feed that to you. I just want to know when you have experienced sexism and how it affected you. So we'll just start with Anjali.
Yeah, sure. So I think I haven't really experienced overt displays of sexism towards me. I think in general, there have been times when I have been subjected to double standards or been told I would be ill-suited to do a particular activity or extracurricular because I'm a woman. But in general, I haven't really experienced that. Perhaps in certain, maybe in the workplace, I have been called competitive or aggressive because I was trying to be assertive or decisive about something. But generally, I've built a certain amount of resilience towards such experiences.
Interesting. And Theodora, yourself?
In all honesty, I don't think I've experienced sexism, or if it has happened to me, I don't think I've ever noticed it. But I think something I do notice is a lack of mutual respect between the sexes, whether that's at uni or just in broader life. A lack of courtesy and civility, which seems to have become more acceptable in recent years since feminists started telling women not to expect special treatment. And I think that's a shame, because men and women are equals and we should treat each other equally well, not equally shabbily or badly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Theodora. And I think it kind of, when I talk about my issues of sexism, maybe they aren't sexism, is just you're not treating me how you claim to treat women generally. And one of my friends, John Humphreys, made this point, which is everyone's kind of sexist, as in if sexism is the definition of treating people different on the basis of their gender, within certain circumstances, we all do that. I don't talk to my male friends the same way I talk to my female friends. But it's about treating people how they want to be treated. There's this old kind of concept of you treat someone how you want to be treated. I think that's what we teach children. That's very simplistic. But I think you treat people how you perceive they want to be treated. And in my experience, it has been that, you know, while I was very active in student politics, they would treat, you know, their left-wing male comrades, of course, very well, but I would be treated incredibly negatively, and probably more negatively than my male counterparts. Maybe that was because I was a threat, because I wasn't fitting their identity politics mold. But I did realize that I got treated much worse, got chased, got spat on, like it got pretty bad. And I always said, imagine the reverse option. Imagine a group of conservative boys harassing a left-wing female student activist. It would be all over the papers. But Dara, have you particularly ever experienced sexism, do you think?
I've felt that I've experienced sexism, or in terms of like overt discrimination or discrimination in general, particularly not in the workplace. I don't feel like that's been an issue. When I've traveled overseas to different countries in particular, I would say that I felt vulnerable as a woman, like physically vulnerable, that I'm generally smaller than men, and have been, you know, I've asked male friends to chaperone me from place to place, sometimes at night, because there is a physical disadvantage you have as a female, being, you know, smaller and less able to defend yourself.
And Joanne, do you think you've ever experienced sexism in your life as a young woman now?
I think, drawing to the story that I just said previously, I think quite a lot of the sexism that I have faced hasn't been from the opposite sex, but from like females. And going to an all-girls school as well, I have found that I've quite often dealt with sexism more with people my own gender than the opposite sex.
That's a good point. And so speaking of this, you know, speaking along these lines about sexism in Australia, I do find that the general narrative is that Australia is this horribly sexist, misogynist country, and that there seems to be so much more focus on the oppression of women in the Western world broadly, rather than the history of women's liberation. You know, for example, the Australasian colonies were the first to give women's the right to vote. It started with New Zealand, it's quickly spread to Australia, yet that's not brought up that much. Anjali, why do you think that in the Western world there seems to be so much focus on you know, the oppression of women rather than all the good work that has been done?
I would say that perhaps it's contemporary mainstream feminism and the shift towards identity politics, which has created this narrative of oppression and victimhood. I think it's also become a tool of furthering social and political influence, because if you focus on all the negatives and you point the blame to others, it's a lot more easier to sort of deflect or cover up your own criticisms or your own incompetencies, or avoid responsibility for your actions or your faults. So and I think you see this a lot with women in power, for example, such as in our political spheres. We see women saying that because they were bullied because they were a woman, or that their poor policy decisions were because of misogyny, or because of their gender or discrimination. So in such cases, I think this helps them to sort of cover up perhaps their lack of incompetence. That's not to say that issues such as sexism or misogyny do not occur. I just think it's become overinflated by this victimhood narrative, and I think that's really saddening, and it sort of insults the generations of women who have fought for liberty, because we have made tremendous gains in women's liberation, and we have personal agency and political autonomy, and we're able to fulfill and reach our potentials as women nowadays that we did not have those same rights before. So suddenly I think that it's sort of societal changes with identity politics and feminism that have actually influenced some of these images.
So speaking of this tendency of right now and Western culture to exaggerate issues or ignore the positive outcomes that we have achieved for women in our society, Theodora, do you think that modern Western feminism has become too focused on trivialities, really?
Yeah, look, I absolutely think modern feminism has failed in its original goals, because there does seem to be no end to the tiny, trivial problems they seem to find in our society. Women are relatively free in our society compared to many other countries, women go to university in greater numbers than men, I think. Women are free to pursue whatever career they want, and yet feminists demand quotas for the workplace. They run, for example, separate workshops at my uni specifically for women only. So I think it's ridiculous that a cause which wanted equality of the sexes once upon a time now wants more than equality. And another thing that I would add is that feminism has become this, it's so much become this amalgamation of progressive ideologies and progressive causes that it's not representing every woman anymore. Conservative women's groups are constantly banned from marching in the annual Women's March, for example, and although feminists once claimed to advocate for choice for all women, stay-at-home mums are mocked by feminists for their choices, while women who choose to prioritize their careers are praised for their choices. So I think that's pretty hypocritical, and I think that not only is feminism focusing on incredibly unimportant issues, but it's also become more exclusive, and it doesn't care about representing the interests of all women anymore.
Very good points there. Dara, do you think that modern feminism has strayed too far from its original goals?
I think going back on your point you made previously, that the problem is mainly that there's never been a pause. They've never stopped to look at their success. And if they had if there was, and women's, the women's movement had stopped and actually, had a look at the success that they have created, then maybe we could have had a look at other countries and other situations that women find themselves in. I'm incredibly privileged to be here in Australia, where I have, my freedom and my ability to vote and my ability to have a career and make all the choices that I can make for myself. But it's not necessarily that this has been expanded to all women, and there's many women that are currently missing out on this ability. A women's movement that is concerned about the freedom of all women would be far more productive than this kind of trivial kind of nitpicking that we're seeing now, where we're worrying about the temperature of offices and all these sorts of crazy nitpicking kind of things. This is just completely counterintuitive and counterproductive when you consider the plight of all women in the world.
Yeah, I really agree, and I think Christina Hoff Sommers kind of touches on this when she speaks about it, is that the women in the West are so focused on their own so-called oppression that they can't see the wood for the trees, and that there are a lot of other issues that we could be out there, giving assistance for. We don't want to be, there is the whole concept of the white savior complex. We don't want to go in and take control. But when I hear other women from countries where they are being oppressed, the main call seems to be, where are you? Why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you coming to support us? And I think that's where hopefully there will be some more modern feminism going down that track if sanity prevails. But it's been great to hear all of your opinions on these really important issues. But to finish up the show, I would like to hear from all of you about what you appreciate most about living in Australia, and what also you think still needs to improve for women. So we'll start with Joanne.
I think going off what Dara just said, I think definitely we tend to forget how much we've progressed in Western society in terms of women's rights. And in terms of what I'm most appreciative of in Australia is, I think the fact that women get to vote is probably the most important, as this entire panel, we're all politically active and we all have our own opinions. I think that's probably the thing that I value most about living in Australia, that we get to voice our own opinions and that we get to be politically active.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And Anjali, what do you appreciate most about living in Australia?
I certainly agree with Joanne there. I think I really appreciate the classical liberal values of that our society is founded on, and the ability to have that political autonomy to express my thoughts freely and to even have a platform to do so, as well as the ability to know that I can have aspirations and I have opportunities to advance myself and not feel fettered. So I think that those are things that I really appreciate and value about living in Australia.
And Dara, what do you love about living in Australia?
Probably what I've said so far, that is, I value my liberty, although I think there could be an expansion of liberty, obviously, that works for the IPA. And I value my safety as well, that this is an incredibly safe country for women. I would expand on that and say, you know, a point of that the women's movement could expand into is actually the ability for women to defend themselves. But I don't think the feminist movement is going to take up "I am women, give me pepper spray" anytime soon, but I think they should.
No, yeah, I totally agree. I want my pepper spray, definitely. And Theodora, we'll finish with you. What do you appreciate about living in Australia as a woman? And is there anything that you think needs to improve?
I think what I love most about Australia is, as the others have said, it's truly a land of opportunity for women and for everyone who lives here. So we get to work and study and raise families in safety, and we get the choice of how we want to live our lives, which I think can't be overstated. We are so lucky to live in a country where we get to choose, for the most part, how we live our lives. And in terms of what needs to improve, I guess I'm pretty optimistic. I don't really think we need to change too much, although maybe down the line something might change for the worse for women. But at this stage, other than maybe the pepper spray, I think there's really very little to be improved.
Yeah, I think we're doing pretty awesome, us ladies down under. But thank you all for being on this show, and thank you all for listening. My name is Renee Gorman. I am the National Manager of Generation Liberty. Can you please thank Dara, Anjali, Theodora, and Joanne for being on this amazing Women in Liberty special. If you are not a member of Generation Liberty, it is $10. Go to generationliberty.org.au and you will get an awesome bag of merch with books, stickers, some of the stuff that's actually back up on my props up here, like these awesome "Don't Tread on Me" stickers with an echidna with the Australian twist. It's worth more than $10. It's the fastest growing youth movement in Australia. Come join us. Come listen to Viral Banter. See you next week. Stay happy, stay safe, but most importantly, stay free. Bye.